Okay, think about this for a second. What if the secret to winning one of the most important battles of World War II wasn't some brilliant general, or a new kind of tank, or even a massive bomb, but a change in altitude of just 30 feet? Seriously, that's about the height of a 3-story building. It seems like nothing, right? But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, during the final desperate months of the war, that tiny gap of air, that 30 feet, completely rewrote the rules of survival on the battlefield. I want you to put yourself there. It's December 1944. You're a German soldier, you're freezing cold, and you've been fighting for years. You've learned one thing that has kept you alive this whole time. When the shells start falling, you dive into a foxhole. The earth is your shield. It's your sanctuary. The ground soaks up the blast, and the shrapnel screams way over your head. It's the one rule you can count on. But then, one morning, the American artillery opens up, and something is just wrong. The explosions aren't hitting the ground. They're happening in the air, right above you. And all at once, your sanctuary has become a death trap. The one thing you do to save your life now guarantees you're going to die. This was the terrifying new reality that just shattered an entire army's will to fight.
So here's how we're going to break down this incredible story. We're going to start right there, in that foxhole, and feel the sheer terror of this weapon that seemed to break all the rules. Then, we'll go to the moment of crisis and see the forbidden career-ending decision one man had to make. After that, we'll dive into the math and the brilliant physics that turned a simple shell into a thinking weapon. Then we're pulling back the curtain on the huge, unseen industrial giant that made it all possible. And finally, we'll trace the legacy of that 30-foot airburst all the way from the snows of Belgium to the conflicts of today.
You know, for hundreds of years of warfare, the physics of staying alive were pretty straightforward. A cannonball or an artillery shell hits the ground and it explodes. Simple. About half of its destructive power just blasts down into the dirt, digging a hole. The other half explodes outward, horizontally. So it makes perfect sense, right? If you are below the surface of the ground, in a trench or a foxhole, you are almost certainly going to be okay. This was a law of the battlefield, as basic and as true as gravity. But in the winter of 1944, that law was about to be completely and utterly erased. This right here, this quote from a captured German officer, it tells you everything you need to know about the psychological shock this thing caused. They weren't just up against a bigger gun. They were facing something that felt impossible, something that defied the laws of physics as they knew them. It wasn't random. The shells were detonating with this terrifying, almost intelligent precision, always at the exact height to cause the most damage. For the soldiers on the ground, it felt like they were being hunted by a weapon that knew exactly where they were hiding. So how did this impossible weapon get there? Well, the story doesn't start in some high-tech lab. It starts in the freezing pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, with one man, a colonel named Oscar Axelson, facing an absolutely impossible choice. He's watching as Hitler's last great offensive, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge, is about to smash right through his lines. He knows his men are about to be overrun, completely annihilated, and he has a secret weapon that could save them, but he has been given direct, explicit orders not to use it.
And this decision wasn't made over a few days in some comfy headquarters. Look at the clock. At 5:31 in the morning, the desperate call for help comes in. Just 1 minute later, 1 minute, Colonel Axelson makes a choice that could get him thrown in prison. He orders his artillery to fire the VT shells. VT stood for variable time. This tech was so secret, so top secret, that using it over land where a dud could be found and reverse engineered was strictly forbidden. But Axelson's men were dying. So just 47 minutes after the attack started, those forbidden shells went screaming into the sky. And that colonel, in that moment, changed the entire course of the battle.
So, what was the secret? What was inside these shells that made Axelson's gamble so decisive? The answer is a tiny, revolutionary piece of technology that German scientists themselves had gone on record saying was pure fantasy, an engineering impossibility. This wasn't just a bigger explosion, it was a smarter one.
It's almost unbelievable, but every single one of these shells had its own tiny radio station packed into the nose. As the shell is flying through the air, it's sending out a radio signal. When the signal bouncing back from the ground gets strong enough, the fuse knows it's at the perfect altitude, about 30 feet, and then boom, it triggers the explosion. Now, the real miracle here wasn't just the idea. It was making something that delicate survive being fired out of a cannon. Each fuse, with its little glass vacuum tubes and fragile electronics, had to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. It was such an incredible engineering achievement that the enemy literally could not believe it was real.
And the difference this made is just staggering. By blowing up 30 feet in the air, the fuse completely changed the physics of the explosion. Look at the ground burst. Half the energy is wasted digging a crater. But with the air burst, 100% of the energy is directed downwards, in a perfect cone of supersonic steel fragments. It's literally raining death down at an angle that makes foxholes, trenches, any kind of cover completely useless. Your place of safety is now a kill box. The lethal radius more than doubled, sure, but the real impact was so much bigger than that.
Just let that number sink in. 50 times. This was not a small improvement, it was a complete game changer. It means one shell with this new fuse could now do the work of 50 old ones. For the soldiers on the receiving end, it meant there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. It just shattered their morale. It broke up attacks before they could even get started. It was a quantum leap in killing power, and the German army had absolutely no defense against it. But the story of this fuse is about way more than just a clever piece of tech. To really get why it was so powerful, you have to zoom out from the battlefield. Because the real weapon the Germans were up against wasn't just a shell. It was the entire American system that built it. A system that, for all their engineering genius, they just couldn't compete with. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're mind-blowing. The project cost what would be $15 billion today, making it second only to the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. They made over 22 million of these little radio stations. At its peak, the program was cranking out over 40,000 of them every single day. This wasn't some secret lab with a handful of scientists. This was a full-on mobilization of an entire country's industrial and brain power. And check this out. It wasn't some top-down government military project. It was a nationwide team effort. You had companies that were normally fierce competitors like RCA, Sylvania, even Kodak, all working together, sharing trade secrets and production lines to get this done. It was this flexible, cooperative approach that allowed them to build at such an incredible speed and scale. And that was a huge advantage over Germany's more rigid, top-down system.
So who were the real heroes of this industrial miracle? The answer might actually surprise you. The vast majority of the people putting these unbelievably complex little devices together were women. They were in these clean rooms, meticulously assembling 130 tiny components for each fuse, working to tolerances smaller than a human hair. There's such a profound contrast there, isn't there? The brutal, chaotic violence of war was only made possible by the quiet, delicate, and precise work of hundreds of thousands of women back on the home front.
So, were the Germans just completely blindsided by this? Well, the really devastating answer is no, not at all. 2 months before the Battle of the Bulge, their own spies correctly identified the weapon. They even warned Berlin that its effect on soldiers would be catastrophic, but the High Command just dismissed it. Why? Because their own scientists had tried to build a fuse like this and they'd failed. So they just figured, if we can't do it, it must be impossible. It was a fatal case of technical arrogance, a belief that they were so superior that no one could possibly have solved the problem they couldn't.
The impact of Colonel Axelson's forbidden decision was immediate, and it was decisive. But the fuse's real legacy, well, that goes far beyond just one battle. That 30-foot airburst wasn't just the end of the foxhole. It was the dawn of an entirely new era of warfare.
You really can't get a more powerful endorsement than this one. General George S. Patton, a guy who believed in guts, tanks, and raw aggression, gave the credit for victory to this little piece of technology he called the funny fuse. After he saw these shells completely obliterated German counterattack, the famous skeptic became a believer. It was definitive proof that a technological edge could break the will of even the toughest, most experienced soldiers.
And here it is, the final crushing irony of this whole story. During the battle, German troops actually captured crates full of 20,000 perfectly intact proximity fuses. They were literally holding the technology that was destroying them in their hands. But because their own leaders had already declared it to be impossible, they had no idea what they were looking at. The war-winning secret was right there, and they probably just threw it away, a victim of their own institutional blindness.
When you boil it all down, the story of the proximity fuse is really a tale of two competing systems. That German soldier in the foxhole, he wasn't just fighting an American soldier. He was fighting the Ford Motor Company. He was fighting RCA. He was fighting the women in the Sylvania factory. While Germany was pouring its resources into these expensive, impractical wonder weapons like the V2 rocket, America was focused on practical, game-changing tech, and then, and this is the most important part, mass-producing it on a scale the world had never even imagined.
The proximity fuse was so much more than just a weapon. It was a fundamental shift. It was the very first time a piece of dumb ammunition was given a brain. It proved that a weapon could sense its environment and make a decision all on its own. And you can see its descendants all around us today. Every laser-guided bomb, every GPS-guided missile, every autonomous drone flying right now, they all share a common ancestor, that humble little fuse that first taught a shell how to think.
And so that leaves us with this final big question. The German soldiers in the Ardennes, they were brave, they were tough, they were determined. But in the end, their courage didn't matter against a system that could churn out 22 million thinking shells and treat them like they were disposable. It really forces you to ask, where does the true strength of a nation come from? Is it just from the heroism of its soldiers on the front lines? Or is it also found in the collaborative genius of its scientists, the quiet precision of its workers, and the overwhelming power of its factories? The story of those 30 feet of air suggests that maybe, just maybe, victory is forged long before the first shot is ever fired.